So my research is in regards to a comparative study in ethics concerning Śāntideva and Immanuel Kant. Śāntideva is an 8th century scholar from Nalanda and is usually attributed to a very eloquent exposition of how Madhyamakas perceive ethics, though Prasangics might usually claim that that Śāntideva is strictly arguing from the Prasangic point of view of Madhyamaka, while Śāntideva was writing his famous literary pieces in ethics, there was no distinction between Prasangic and Svatantric as we have it contemporarily established. So I would usually just address him as a Madhyamaka philosopher. And also we have Immanuel Kant, a late 18th century German philosopher that is well known for responding to skepticism in philosophy of science, as well as utilitarians and consequentialists in philosophy of ethics, morality. So these are some of the methodological approaches that I've had throughout the research. I have been addressing the Bodhisattvacharya Avatara by Śāntideva, as well as his Shiksha Samuchaya. And also I've taken from Kant his anthology, as well as his exposure of critique of pure reason. Secondary sources have also been used from Western philosophers that are also contemporary. The purpose of this comparative study was to find out how well we can understand Śāntideva through a lens of Western philosophical analysis, in terms of how can the language that we use to describe Western ethics can apply to a Madhyamaka philosopher. So some of the vocabulary and linguistics that have been used to describe these kind of Western views of philosophy of ethics are utilitarianism, deontology, and more specifically the classical utilitarian view, which Kant definitely rejects, but some scholars have made the claim that Śāntideva somehow tries to incorporate into his ethical view. Specifically, it is the actions that are right in proportion as they do tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Some of the limitations that arise with these kind of methodological inquiries is that, first of all, these two traditions didn't talk to each other, right? Kant didn't exist while Śāntideva was writing his papers, but also more importantly, Nalanda's literature did not exist in Europe either during the late 18th century. Surely 50, 60 years afterwards, when Schopenhauer read the Gita and the Upanishads and so on, we see some intersectional, intracultural discussion of Indian philosophy in general within the German sphere. However, Kant himself did not have access to such literature and philosophy. Also, asking whether or not we can analyze Śāntideva through the lens of Western ethics is as difficult as analyzing whether or not Kant can be interpreted through a through a Buddhist philosophy. So these are some of the views that are contemporarily discussed by Western scholars in regards to Śāntideva and Kant, or more broadly, Śāntideva and Western ethics. Though Śāntideva differs dramatically from Aristotle in many ways, there can be no doubt that he is deeply concerned with the cultivation of character, and that he is much more interested than at least some Western utilitarians have been in the question of how we can become better people. Thus, the possibility of important similarities between Śāntideva's thought and theories within the domain of virtue ethics should not be disregarded. Also, from the book of Emirs for Reflection, Understanding Buddhist Ethics, Jake Davis argues that perhaps this is more of the some things about Buddhist ethics seem very familiar on the surface, and this super crucial to resemblance has masked an important underlying difference within Western ethics. So though it is important to understand that we can do comparative study and we can do comparative philosophy, it is also important to understand that initially when these famous philosophers have written their tenets, they did not use the vocabulary that each other has had, more so, arguably not with the same intentionalities. So, also in addition, some Western scholars make the arguments that the Western tenets of ethical thought since classical Greece have been more elaborate and more eloquent in contrast to how Buddhism describes ethics. And some of the reasons why some scholars argue for such perspective is because of the philosophies of anatta or anatman and shunyata within Western philosophy and within Buddhism, right? Because their argument is essentially that you need a moral agent in order to have a kind of moral reasoning. Moral actions are performed by moral individuals. So insofar as there is no self, how can there be moral agency? These are some of the questions that posed, and in addition, they try to justify the claim that Buddhism is not as robust in ethics because of these questions of selflessness in regards to what a body has in relation to the consciousness that the body inhabits. However, Kant believes that human beings should respect one another's rights and act altruistically towards each other so that they are furthering all respective ends. A deontological interpretation of Buddhist ethics has attracted little support. It has evidently not been deemed plausible to suppose that the whole of Buddhist ethics could be fundamentally a matter of respecting the rules of Buddhist truth. So contemporarily, the way Western scholars read Śāntideva or anybody else that has inclined predispositions towards Buddhist ethics, they read them as utilitarians, as consequentialists, as the kind of ethicists that are more concerned with maximizing happiness and minimizing pain rather than following some universal rule of morality or something rather that is virtue-oriented. However, my research will try to respond to such contemporary conventions and actually try to argue that Śāntideva could in fact be read as either a deontologist or a virtue ethicist, depending on how the conventions arise relative to deontology as well as the virtues of the Greeks. So these are some of the passages that I've drawn from the initial text of Śāntideva and Kant and tried to put them side by side to make the claim that in fact, surely there are some utilitarian aspects of Śāntideva's writings. However, they can be taken out of context and misinterpret Śāntideva because the whole point of the Bodhisattva path, the whole point of the fundamentals of the paramitas and so on, including moral discipline and meditative concentration, include a value-oriented goal. These paramitas, these Mahayanist ethics, are not simply for maximizing pleasure or mundane happiness while minimizing pain. The purpose of this ethical training on the Mahayana path is to ultimately lead to nirvana, is to ultimately lead to the cessation, right? So because of that, they cannot be simply interpreted as some short-term satisfactions of the body, but rather the point of these Mahayanist ethics is to individual practitioner or the Sangha or the collective of practitioners to interact in a sphere of ethics that is beneficial to nirvana. So, looking at Śāntideva, he says, when my mind is averse that interest of others and seeks my own self-interest, or when it wishes to speak out of a desire for an audience, then I will remain still like a piece of wood. And also Kant says, a judgment upon an object of satisfaction may be quite disinterested, but yet very interesting, not based on an interest, but bringing an interest with it. Of this kind are all pure moral judgments. Judgments of taste, however, do not in themselves establish only interest. Only in societies are these interesting things for taste. So what is fascinating about both Śāntideva and Kant is that they use a form of disinterestedness in order to justify their ethics. When we look at contemporary moral philosophy, when we look at contemporary political conventions, usually people argue or behave out of self-interest. This might benefit me in some way, therefore I will act in such and such way. However, both Kant and Śāntideva make a very clear observation that such kind of perspective in terms of how we interact with ethics and what we view as moral behavior is actually fallacious. Why? Because what truly arises when we talk about morality is a lack of self-interest, meaning Kant is very, very interested, ironically interested, Kant is very devoted to this idea that this lack of personal interest, this lack of desire for the personal gains is truly what gives rise to proper ethics. And also, inarguably, Śāntideva does the same. So there are many passages in the Bodhisattva Charyavatara where he wants his own merit to be shared with all sentient beings. This kind of selfless altruism is truly at the core of both Kant's and Śāntideva's ethics, or so I argue. But another kind of form that is similar for both Kant and Śāntideva is the focus on mental discipline, or some kind of training that leads to proper moral thoughts, that leads to proper moral behavior. Because usually in the West, when we talk about utilitarian ethics, when we talk about consequentialism, we talk strictly about the outcomes that arise out of a kind of ethical behavior. We're not very concerned about what the subject experiences when they talk about morality. They don't talk much about what the subject experiences when they contemplate moral actions, but simply those kind of schools are strictly concerned with what is the outcome of the ethical action, and that is how we evaluate its moral worth. However, Kant, as a deontologist, is very contrary to that view. Kant is very concerned about what goes on in an individual's mind when that kind of moral reasoning arises. So these are some of the passages that also come from the anthology. Taste, like the judgment in general, is the discipline or training of genius. It clips its wing closely and makes it cultured and nourished. But at some time it gives guidance to where and how far it may extend itself. It is also remain purposive. And while it brings clearness and an order to the multitude of the thoughts, it makes the idea susceptible of being permanently and at some time universally ascended to and capable of being followed by others in an ever-progressive culture. There is therefore no rational psychology as a discipline furnishing any addition to our self-knowledge, but only as a discipline fixing unpassable limits to a speculative reason in this field, partly to keep us from throwing ourselves into the arms of a soulless materialism, partly to warn us against losing ourselves in a vague and, with regard to practical life, baseless spiritualism. It is very important to understand that surely there are questions of what was really Kant's theology. What did Kant actually believe in when he was making his claims about God or the universe or so on? But from this passage we can easily understand that Kant was more of an anti-materialist than somebody that was trying to promote some sort of spiritual relationship with the divine. Kant was very concerned about the motivations, the intentions that we have when we create this kind of ethical action, when we create a view about moral discipline. And so does Śāntideva say. Yet despite the lofty nature of even the rest of the stages, countless aeons separate the attainment of the stage of the meditative absorption like a diamond, Vajrapana Samadhi, that marks the translation from the 10th stage of to Buddhahood. These aeons are led with discipline and determined practice. Those who always have faith and devotion to the Buddha don't give up on moral discipline and their training. Those who don't give up on moral discipline and their training are praised as having abilities by those with abilities. Meaning, people that are trained in the moral discipline, people that take up on the paramitas as a guide to live and to ascend to enlightenment, are also people that can recognize in other sentient beings that try to embrace the paramitas as a form of practice, that they do have the desire and the bodhicitta to do so. Therefore, we can see from these parallels that the way Kant and Śāntideva discuss this kind of inner mental training is salient towards how we actually understand their philosophies. And more so, there can be further questions about how can we interpret these two philosophers in a more metaphysical sense, right? Because Kant was inarguably inspired by Christianity, particularly the Protestant Christianity, whereas Śāntideva was obviously a proponent of Mahayanist, particularly Madhyamaka views. And yet, however, it seems that the way Kant discusses angels and the way Śāntideva talks about bodhisattvas as friends along the path have a very similar literary flavor when we discuss ethics. Because both Śāntideva and Kantideva aren't really these kind of, dry, boring philosophers that you read, but they really have some poetic elements that bring an interesting literary flavor to what went on in their minds and also what they actually meant when they were trying to create their ethical tenets. And these are some of the linguistic adaptations that the research is concerned with. For example, Śāntideva uses the word value a lot, but there are questions of whether or not they mean the same thing when they talk about values, right? Because while we talk in the West of value as property or material value, it doesn't really have to be the same kind as a value of moral reasoning, sure. So it's also really interesting that both of them talk about the impersonality of moral laws, meaning that even though there might not be a moral agent that enacts these kind of moral behaviors, both of them promote selflessness and lack of interest into what actually morality means, and also questions of virtue and moral epistemology, because both Madhyamakas and Kant are very interested in why and how we know things. However, they came to different conclusions on that. So, thank you.
एक साहे